such sentences are proven to lead to more reoffending and so create more victims of crime than tried and tested alternatives such as women's centres. The Justice Secretary and his team know this, but they've chosen to ignore the evidence. So will the Minister tell the House today how many crimes her department's own research says would be prevented by investing in such alternatives to ineffective short prison sentences?
Mr. Speaker, we are very interested in looking at alternative to prison sentences. While we want the most serious offenders who commit serious violence and sexual crimes to spend the appropriate amount in prison, we also want to ensure that there are sentences on offer that the judiciary have confidence in and that will turn people's lives around. And we're already working to improve the quality of information that sentences receive about community sentencing options, including, for example, that an offender is a primary caregiver and is pregnant or has given birth in the last 6 months, in order that they can take that into account and give the appropriate sentence.
Richard Bergen.
Mr. Speaker, to help with that answer, the government's own research says investment in alternatives would see over 30,000 fewer crimes every year, an answer the Minister omitted. Yet the Tories are deliberately choosing to ignore the evidence and are failing to properly invest in women's centres and other proven alternatives. Instead, they're chasing hang 'em, flog 'em headlines, thinking that will help win the coming general election. Luckily, the British people are not the mugs that they're trying to take them for. So I ask the Minister, does she agree with their own department's report from July that notes, to quote, a statistically significant increase in proven reoffending for those on short sentences rather than effective community alternatives? If so, will she act on it?
Mr. Speaker, I think the honourable member failed to listen to the answer that I gave to his previous question about the importance this government regards in giving appropriate sentences to appropriate crimes and the particular strategy that we have in relation to female offenders. I was a few weeks ago at HMP Send and I saw how in prison we are turning people's lives around. I met a woman who was due for a parole hearing. She was a lifer who had served 10 years. And she said to me that she wasn't actually ready to be released yet because of the amazing support that she was getting in her prison through the therapeutic community, for the first time realising the consequences of her action. We are absolutely committed to ensuring that women get the right sentences and the right provision in the community and in the prisons.
Davis. Question number 2, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I'd like to group this question with question 9. I work closely with the Attorney-General and Home Office ministers to ensure that the criminal justice system commands public confidence and tackles crime effectively. And to address this and other serious crimes, we're recruiting an additional 20,000 police officers, investing £85 million in the CPS and building an additional 10,000 prison places, together with the work of PCCs in setting up violence reduction units.
Davis. Mr. Speaker. The best way to prevent knife crime is to take them out of circulation, is to take them off the street. Now, what steps is he taking in conjunction with the Attorney-General to ensure that people who carry knives are prosecuted?
Well, of course, the prosecuting authorities take knife crime incredibly seriously, and back in 2015, Mr. Speaker, minimum custodial sentences of 6 months for repeat knife crime possession were introduced, and in the year ending March of this year, 83% of offenders received a custodial sentence for that type of repeat offence.
Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Justice Secretary agree with me that the sentence should reflect the serious nature and the serious damage that knife crime does to our communities? And does he support the work of organisations such as Only Cowards Carry, who help to highlight the devastating damage knife crime does to the individuals involved on both sides?
Well, my honourable friend is right to raise the hard work of that local organisation and many others, such as the Kinsella Trust, which do so much to educate young people about the folly of carrying knives. The new knife crime prevention orders introduced by this government as part of the Offensive Weapons Act earlier this year, I believe, will be a key tool in preventing knife crime, and we're working with the Home Office to develop operational guidance because we want to get on with introducing that programme.
Jenny Chapman.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday it was reported that knife crime in my relatively safe constituency has risen by 50%. This is extremely worrying, particularly for parents with teenage children in Darlington. Will you look at the fact that since 2010, funding for youth offending teams has been halved?
Well, the Honourable Lady, and I think all of us in this House share, whether we're parents or not, the worry about young people either carrying knives or coming into contact with people who do knives. But the truth about the trends in knife crime offending are these, that there was indeed an alarming rise 10 years ago, there was then a decline. We are seeing a rise again. And what we're doing is a twin-pronged approach. It's not just about sentencing, it is about intervention, and that's why announcements on youth funding at last week's Conservative Party conference are welcome, and indeed part of the work that our youth offending teams are doing all across the country.
Lucy Powell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State may be aware of the recent murder of high-flying teenager Yusuf Maki from Manchester, and his killers were found not guilty of either manslaughter or murder. From the very affluent Hale that they were. This case stands in stark contrast to many that I've raised here recently, involving groups of young black men from Moss Side who are all serving mandatory life sentences under joint enterprise. So given that his government's own race audit and Lammy review found that there were burning injustices in our criminal justice system when it comes to race, background, class and wealth, what is the government doing to address these very different outcomes in the same cases?
Well, I think the Honourable Lady raises a very interesting point. I think she'd agree with me that it is difficult to extrapolate trends from individual cases, however concerning and deeply distressing that case was. I think the lesson is that obviously knife crime respects and knows no class or race boundaries. We should not stigmatise this, particularly outside London, as a crime that is exclusively based upon any racial profile. I think that is wrong, but I take the point that she makes, and clearly I think that we need to look very carefully across the piece as to whether we are sometimes being a bit shy and frankly institutionally shy about addressing knife crime in some of the less typical places.
Question 3.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The latest CPS figures from the Violence Against Women and Girls report covering 2018-19 shows that the conviction rate for those cases taken to court has increased from 58% in the previous year to 63% in the year ending March 2019. However, the number of cases reaching court, which peaked in 2015, has declined significantly, and that is a very substantial cause for concern. A number of steps are being taken to address this, including recruiting 20,000 extra police officers and giving the CPS £85 million a year in additional funding.
Mr. Speaker, many women, including many survivors of rape and sexual violence, have lost confidence in our justice system due in part to the appallingly low rate of prosecution for rape. Women's organisations are calling on the government to launch a fully independent review into how our justice system is handling rape cases. So will the Minister take this opportunity to join Labour and commit to delivering on this?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So a review is already underway as a subcommittee of the Criminal Justice Board, and that is due to report in the spring of next year, so in just a few months' time, accompanied by an action plan, which is clearly needed, as the Honourable Lady's question pointed out. The government also announced just a few weeks ago additional funding for the victims of sexual violence, an extra £5 million a year, a 50% increase, bringing annual spending to £13 million a year to support victims of these crimes in exactly the way the Honourable Lady is quite rightly describing.
It was remiss of me not to congratulate the Honourable Gentleman on becoming a Minister, and I hope he enjoys it, and I feel sure that he is uncontrollably excited about the prospects that lie ahead. Anne Milton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Rape and Sexual Abuse Support Centre in Guildford, of which I am a patron, is overwhelmed by women and men requesting help. The abuse often happened years ago, and fear of coming forward means that the perpetrators do not face prosecution. The NSPC closed a loophole campaign aimed to ensure that young men and women are better protected. I don't know what progress has been made in reviewing the 2003 Sexual Offences Act. Maybe the Minister can update us.
Well, my right honourable friend, quite rightly draws attention to the importance of giving victims the confidence to come forward and report these offences, but not just report them, also take them through the system, because there is quite a high dropout rate between the offence being reported and the offence then being prosecuted in court. She mentions a particular centre in her constituency doing excellent work, and I hope some of the additional money that was announced last week may find its way into the hands of that centre to help them in the work they do. In relation to the 2003 Act, I think those are matters being considered as part of the review, which will report back in the spring of next year.
You're a Hobhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I also congratulate him on his new post? And indeed, my question is linked to him being in the post. Rape crisis centres are just simply don't have enough of them, and we need to support better survivors of rape. I would like the government to consider to ratify the Istanbul Convention so that we actually provide, at least directly, to actually providing the right number of rape crisis centres. Will he meet with me?
So via the Domestic Abuse Act, or bill, which is was introduced, I think, last week, a number of steps are being taken in the direction that the Honourable Lady points. I'd also repeat the point I made a moment ago about the additional funding for the victims of rape, a 50% increase, which I hope will increase the provision of the kind that the Honourable Lady is quite rightly calling for.
Mr. Damien Hines.
As the former Education Secretary knows, education is often the route out of a challenging background, and I'd like to pay tribute to all the work he did in his previous role. We know that we can only sustain employment and manage our own budget if you have financial capability. So we have ensured that personal budgeting skills can be taught through the new prison education contracts. And under the new prison framework, 103 out of 104 prisons currently commission functional mathematics qualifications.
I'm grateful to the Minister for that answer. Building up savings can be truly transformational, and the LASPO Act allowed for prisoners' earnings to be paid into an account. Can I encourage my honourable friend to look at that again and enact the regulations as part of her wider work on meaningful paid work?
My honourable friend is right to identify that leaving prison with savings can be hugely beneficial to an offender's rehabilitation. And while he's right to point out that the relevant clauses of LASPO haven't been commenced, we do enable prisoners to save money under the terms of Prisoners' Earnings Act. In addition, all prisoners have access to a prison savings account during their time in custody, and we hope that our recent changes on release on temporary licence will enable an even greater number of prisoners to benefit from savings. Since I've been in post, I've been actively looking at how we can ensure all prisoners have a bank account.
Hey, Green.
Prison with just £48 is not a great start for managing your own finances. So can the Minister say, first of all, if the government plans to review that amount, and secondly, what steps are being taken to streamline the application process for universal credit so that it can start from inside the prison ahead of release?
As I mentioned, we are increasing the opportunity for people to do work on RUTL, which will increase their ability to earn money whilst they are in prison. We are looking at the point that she raises, and in relation to universal credit, my predecessor, now the Lord Chancellor, had a number of meetings with his counterpart in DWP, and offenders are now able to access a DWP work coach prior to release, and so they can make an appointment early and then even on the day of release complete their claim, because universal credit is critical.
Advice and guidance prisoners get whilst in prison, this is of little use if they are released at the weekend when support they need is often not available. How many prisoners as a proportion are released at the weekend, and what are we doing to reduce that?
Well, the honourable member makes an important point about releases on Fridays. It is something that I have been looking at, but I would like to say whether you are released on a Friday, a Thursday, Wednesday or Tuesday or a Monday, it is important that you have accommodation and support whatever day you are released.
Today's report by HMIP is one of the most shocking independent inspection reports I've ever read. Nearly 2/3 of children are going on to reoffend. Accommodation, health services and support on leaving custody are all highlighted as failing. How much longer are ministers going to throw good money after bad in more prison places rather than the targeted investment on education and support that we know helps turn children's lives around?
The honourable member makes an important point about rehabilitating people in prison. We have reduced the youth estate over the years, so there are only the most serious offenders in prison, and we do want to make sure that the appropriate sentences are handed down. But absolutely, education in prison, accommodation on release and universal credits are priorities for this side of the
I hope the Minister would be interested in learning more about the Street and Arrow initiative run by the Scotland's Violence Reduction Unit, which helps ex-offenders make a livelihood through street food vans, which in turn are supported by public projects like the Glasgow Dentist School and the University of Glasgow's construction project. This helps them learn new skills and take initiatives to reduce offending and improve their livelihood. So I hope the Minister would be willing to look at projects like that.
I would be very willing to meet him and discuss this. I must say, as I visited a number of prisons since I've been appointed, I've seen some fabulous schemes around the country. I'm very happy to hear about this one.
Bailey. 5, Mr. Speaker.
With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I would like to group questions 5 and 6. And I'm very pleased at my first orals in this role, Mr. Speaker, to pay tribute to all the hard work of all our prison staff. I've had the opportunity since I was appointed to visit a number of prisons, and I have seen firsthand their dedication. It is critical that we recruit and retain staff to keep our prisons secure. We've invested significantly in increasing staff numbers, recruiting a net total of an additional 4,366 prison officers between October 2016 and June 2019, surpassing our original target of 2,500, and we will continue to recruit officers to ensure that our prisons are decent and safe.
Grim Bailey.
Since 2010, the number of prison officers has dropped by 80,000. Violence and insecurity in our jails has soared. What estimate has she made of the impact in jails of her party conference proposals to increase jail sentences on violent and sexual offenders and the cost of delivering it?
We have recruited since 2016 for over 4,000 staff. The Honourable Gentleman is right to identify that if we prosecute more people, if the police catch more criminals, we prosecute them, there will be more people going into our prisons, and that is why we have committed to investing £2.5 billion on prison places. But he is right to identify it's not just prison places we will need, it is more prison officers. But I should mention that we were ahead of our targets in relation to this amount of recruitment, and the prison service has been lauded as a good employer. For example, where the prison service is in the top 100 graduate employers.
I congratulate the government on its efforts to recruit more prison officers. However, would my honourable friend accept that cuts earlier this decade contribute to a vicious circle of prison violence? Less officers on landings led to more assaults, which caused more staff to leave, leading to more violence and so on. With morale and retention of prison officers at rock bottom, does the Minister accept also that more must be done to reward these brave public servants? For instance, by improving and reducing their retirement age to 60, because 68 is far too late.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the honourable member for Sittingbourne and Sheppey for raising the profile of the work of prison officers in his Westminster Hall debate last year, as well as this morning in questions, and for participating and promoting the excellent prison service parliamentary scheme. He is right to refer to prison officers as brave public servants, and the Secretary of State referred to them in his conference speech as the unsung heroes. We have previously made offers to staff staff to reduce the pension age in 2013 and 2017, both of which were rejected by the Prison Officers Association.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Minister back to the MOJ in her new role. And she, like her predecessors, comes here to this House triumphant about the government's recruitment campaign. However, the reality, Mr. Speaker, is we just have to look at the breakdown in the number of prison officers to see this is far from the truth. 80,000 hours of cumulative experience have been lost. A third of officers have less than 2 years' experience, and the number of officers is now falling again, still lagging 2,500 behind 2010 levels. So will the Minister, in her new role here today, simply commit to bringing prison officer numbers back to 2010 levels?
Mr. Speaker, we've made significant breakthrough in the number of prison officers that we've got. We've introduced a scheme which I have heard as I've gone around visiting is extremely popular among prisoners and prison officers, which is the key worker scheme, which allows prison officers to build relationships with the officers. We are professionalising our workforce in the youth estate, providing all frontline officers with a foundation degree.
Resume your seat. Sorry, Minister. The exchanges are very protracted. I mean, I know lawyers like to expatiate, but forgive me saying so, but the answers are just too long. People are reading out great screeds. That's not what the House wants. Sir Patrick McLaughlin.
But will my honourable friend, in looking at the way in which the prison service operates, also review the kind of prisoners which are sent to open prisons? Bearing in mind the announcements that were made last week, there is concern that open prisons will have more people convicted of very serious offences and not suitable for open prisons. Will she review this?
Well, I can very briefly assure the honourable member that we're looking at recategorisation of offenders, ensuring that they're in the right prisons for them.
Good. Jamie Stone.
Number 7, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, an independent judiciary is the cornerstone of our constitution and our democracy, and we are rightly proud of our world-class judiciary. And as Lord Chancellor, I've sworn an oath to defend their independence, and I take that extremely seriously. I will continue to defend their independence vigorously.
Jamie Stone.
Mr. Speaker, I'm encouraged to hear that answer. That is why, thank God, we're not a totalitarian state. Could I ask the Minister to share his thoughts, rather a scary bit of advice this, with number 10 and perhaps Mr. Dominic Cummings?
Well, I think everybody, whichever part of government or indeed our country they might come from, will probably be aware of my public pronouncements about this, and I will keep saying it again and again and again, as long as it is necessary to do so.
Bob Neal.
Consistent with the Lord Chancellor's speech at the opening of the legal year, will he confirm that there is no place for political involvement in the appointment of judges, and no question but that the rulings of the courts must be observed by all?
I am more than happy to confirm all of those points made so ably by the Chair of the Justice Select Committee.
Mr. Speaker, will the Minister today put on record the fact that he believes not only in the independence of a robust judiciary, but also that his government will obey the law and not crash us out of the European Union against the law?
Well, I can confirm that this government, like its predecessors, and I hope like its successors, will continue to respect and obey the law and respect the rule of law.
Sir Desmond Sway.
Might he honour his oath by restoring the proper role of his office in the other place?
Well, my right honourable friend tempts me along the path of debate about the Constitution, and in particular the 2005 Act. Whilst I'm always keen to engage in academic constitutional debate, I think we have many other fish to fry at the moment, Mr. Speaker.
Joanna Cherry.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank the Lord Chancellor for speaking out in favour of the independence of the judiciary? Lord Hope of Craighead, a former Deputy President of the Supreme Court and Lord President of the Court of Session, has pointed out that in the prorogation case, the Supreme Court justices were careful to explain in their judgment that they weren't pronouncing on political questions, and the issues with which they were dealing were issues of law. Will he explain that to those in his parties demanding a politicised appointment process for the judiciary?
Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable and Learned Lady, and the remarks of the Noble Lord Hope are ones that I take with extreme gravity, bearing in mind his experience and knowledge. I think it always bears repeating that the judiciary are not motivated by political beliefs or motivations, and that case was no exception. And frankly, I think the matter needs to have no further debate. And if we ended up, Mr. Speaker, in an American-style approval system, then I think we would all be the poorer for it.
Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, a Scottish court recorded the Prime Minister's unequivocal promise to comply with his statutory duties under the Benn Act. And the judge, Lord Pentland, went on to say, and I quote, "It would be destructive of one of the core principles of constitutional propriety and of the mutual trust that is the bedrock of the relationship between the court and the Crown, for the Prime Minister or the Government to renege on what they have assured the court that the Prime Minister intends to do. Can the Lord Chancellor assure us that he will be impressing on the Prime Minister the grave consequences of ignoring that warning from a senior member of the Scottish Judiciary?
Well, I read the judgment of Lord Pentland with great interest. Of course, that is a matter subject to appeal, and I think it would be wrong of me to comment in detail about it, but those comments are noted.
Bergen.
We've seen the Justice Secretary forced to take to Twitter to defend the independence of the judiciary and the rule of law after recent briefings from number 10 Downing Street. He may well have to do that again later today after this morning's headlines. The Attorney General has briefed the press that he will resign if the government refuses to adhere to the law, demanding an extension to rule out a no deal. Would the Justice Secretary do the same?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I hope that members in this House and elsewhere feel that I have done my duty and discharged the duties under my oath, and I will continue to do that, and I will take whatever step I deem necessary in order to make sure that I have been true to that oath and true to the rule of law.
Faisal Rashid. Number 8.
Mr. Speaker, we've already announced we'll be strengthening probation by bringing back into the National Probation Service the supervision of offenders, and in July we published a draft operating blueprint.
Rashid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The former Justice Secretary's decision to privatise probation in 2013 was set up to fail from the start. Now that he has announced a partial U-turn, can he set out of the House the full cost from start to finish of the failed privatisation of probation services?
We recognise that there is more that we can do in relation to probation, which is why we are changing the system. But what Transforming Rehabilitation did was bring 40,000 people back into supervision, and we are ensuring that the new procedure will work well.
Derek Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Good probation can really be the means for transforming young lives and helping them to rehabilitate into communities. Across Cornwall, we don't have a prison, but we have many people that are involved in this process. But what can the Minister do to help these organisations to really get the funds they need to support these young lives to play a full part in life?
The new system will ensure that while offender management is brought in-house, private sector innovation will be involved in providing unpaid work, and there'll be a new dynamic framework to enable new schemes and charities to be able to bid to provide bespoke local services. So I'm very happy to talk to him what might be provided in Cornwall.
Sybil Roberts.
I rise as the co-chair of the Justice Union's cross-party group. Now, following disastrous mismanagement by the former probations provider Working Link, it is to be welcomed that probation in Wales is due to come back under public control by the 2nd of December. Now, the terms of which staff are employed by HMPPS in Wales will therefore set a benchmark for England too. How confident is she that terms will be agreed with unions over the next 7 weeks? And what will be the consequences if this doesn't happen?
We are working very hard to ensure that we succeed in Wales. As she's mentioned, it is the first of our operations. I did meet with representatives of NAPO, GMB and Unison at the end of last month to discuss this very issue, and we're working very hard to ensure that matters are in place by the end of the year.
Mary McCarthy.
Question 10, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I absolutely agree with the Honourable Member for Bristol East that finding accommodation for prisoners at the end of their sentence is vital. That's why we've already started pilots to help offenders released from 3 prisons secure and maintain accommodation from release. These are in Bristol, Pentonville and in Leeds, with £6.4 million from the government's rough speaking.
Harry McCarthy.
The Honourable Member for Sheffield Heeley has already mentioned today's report that said that young offenders were being set up to fail when they were released. And one of the concerns raised in that report was about the quality of unregulated supported living, which is a real concern in Bristol. Can I urge her to talk to her counterparts in the Department of Housing to see how we can bring in regulation for supported housing?
The Honourable Member makes a very interesting point. I'd like to assure her that we do liaise with MHCLG. In fact, on Thursday, I am going with my counterpart from MHCLG to visit one of the pilots in Leeds, and I will raise that point with him.
Buckinghamshire Knight, Sir David Liddington.
Mr. Speaker, can I first welcome what my honourable friend has said about the pilot projects now underway and wish them success. Will she agree that since up to 30% by some estimates of people sleeping rough on the streets are people with a prison record, that one of the best ways to secure a reduction in re-offending will be to step up these schemes and make sure that when someone's served their time, they can have a roof over their heads on release?
I agree very much, and with the experienced right honourable member from whom I learnt so much as his PPS. He's absolutely right about accommodation. We're looking at these pilots. We're also trying to expand approved premises estate by an extra 200 beds. Accommodation is a critical matter, and we're looking very hard into it.
Andy Slaughter.
Number 12, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, I'll group this question with question 16. Digitisation is indeed designed to improve access to justice and, of course, efficiency in the court system as well. Last year, 150,000 people accessed court services online. To date, no fewer than 63,491 people have entered uncontested divorce proceedings online. Take-up rate is now 62% and growing. 94,975 people have issued or responded to civil money claims to date, and they report an 88% satisfaction rating, and no fewer than 317,206 minor pleas have been entered since 2014, and if the House is wondering, 85% of those pleas were guilty and 15% of those pleas were not guilty.
Andy Slaughter.
From next April, the vast majority of personal injury claims will have to be dealt with online and without the benefit of legal advice. However, even the Association of British Insurers, the major advocate and beneficiary of this policy, don't think the government will be ready. They're urging the government to drop the proposed increase in the small claims limit for employers and public liability and concentrate on road traffic claims. As the government often follows the ABI's advice, will they on this occasion?
Well, this House has been in the process of legislating in this area for some time. Of course, the Courts and Prisons Act 2017 fell at the election. We finally legislated in the Civil Liability Act 2018. It is due to be implemented along with the £5,000 limit for the small claims track in April next year, and it remains the government's intention to do that.
Peter Alders.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In Suffolk, nearly half of all victims of domestic abuse or sexual offences are unwilling to proceed with prosecutions. Section 75 of the Domestic Abuse Bill will help improve the situation, but can the Minister confirm that the Government are committed to root and branch reform so as to remove the culture of confrontation, fear and intimidation in the courts and tribunal system?
Well, I think my honourable friend raises a very important point. It's one that was touched on by members in question 3 earlier. It is vitally important that we help victims of these terrible crimes to pursue the case right through the court system rather than dropping it after reporting it, and there is a lot more to do there. The provisions in the Domestic Abuse Bill introduced for its second reading last week will help that, as will the increased funding to support victims of these terrible crimes that I referred to earlier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government has undertaken unprecedented sell-off courts that has made giving evidence in court far more difficult for many victims of crime. who now have to travel much further to have their day in court. And as the Honourable Member for Waverley just alluded to, the fact that victims of sexual and other physical abuse are already reluctant to come to court, and this plays into it even more. Will the Minister agree to an independent assessment of the impact of these court closures and commit to no further closures unless it can be proved that they're not having a detrimental impact on access to justice?
Well, of course, access to justice considerations are extremely important, and before any court is earmarked for closure, there is an extremely thorough consultation process, and if there are any courts in the future due to close, a similarly thorough consultation process will be gone through. I would point out that in the cohort of courts consulted upon in 2015, on average, which was subsequently closed, on average their utilisation rates were about 1/3. So we do need to balance a reasonable approach to the court estate with the access to justice considerations you quite rightly raises.
Number 13, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, the Government has not conducted a public consultation on the law in relation to assisted suicide. We remain of the view that any change to the law in this sensitive area is a matter of conscience and a matter for Parliament rather than one of government policy.
The Minister will be aware that under the current law, people can be sentenced to up to 14 years in prison for assisting the suicide of a terminally ill loved one and great pain, and that the CPS is pursuing prosecutions with traumatic effects in some cases. So why has the Government decided to abandon even a call of evidence which his predecessor initiated only a few weeks ago?
Well, I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman for his question. There was no initiation of a call for evidence. However, I hear his point about prosecutions. The Crown Prosecution Service guidelines that were actually pioneered by the Right Honourable and Learned Gentleman, the member for Holborn and St Pancras, actually, in my view, strike a very sensitive and sensible balance between the need to protect the vulnerable, but also to understand the sensitive and emotive circumstances of many of these tragic cases.
Sarah Newton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, the Police and Crime Commissioner for Durham, Ron Hogg, said there needed to be changes in the law for assisted dying, and this reflects the view of many in the police. So I know the Secretary of State for Justice is a very compassionate man. So will he meet with police officers to discuss their concerns?
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend who has taken a very close and active interest and involvement in this issue. Of course, I would be happy to meet with police officers, and indeed I've committed to meet with others on this issue. But I do harbour the gravest of doubts about the ability of legislation that can be watertight when it comes to the potential for, sadly, abuse.
Mr. Nicholas Edward Coleridge-Bowles.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and it's a great pleasure to ask a question to my old friend, the Lord Chancellor. And I fear that he may not have received complete information from his officials, because his immediate predecessor did ask for a call for evidence and ask for number 10 approval of a call for evidence. It is true that the previous Prime Minister resigned before that request could be approved, but the previous Lord Chancellor did make clear that he thought a call for evidence was justified. And just to be clear as to why, it's not that government is going to take a position on a possible change of law, but only government can gather the information about the effect of the current law in order that Parliament can then decide whether that law needs to be changed.
Well, I'm very grateful to my old friend, the Honourable Member, for the way in which he asked that question. The comments that he makes are ones that I accept. It wasn't agreed that there should be a call for evidence. It isn't my plan to initiate one. However, the discussions and conversations will continue, and the wealth of information that we do have out there on both sides of the argument is something that I know will prompt Honourable and Right Honourable Members to continue this debate either on the floor of this House or by other means.
Lucy Allen.
Mr. Speaker, Parliament is out of step with the people on this issue. 90% of the UK population believes that assisted dying should be legalised. Shropshire man Noel Conway recently had his case turned down in the Supreme Court because they believed it was a matter for Parliament to decide. So does the Minister agree with me that Parliament must once again look at this issue, because it cannot be right for us to decide that terminally ill people in great suffering have no right over how they choose to die?
My honourable friend raises the Noel Conway case, and in that case the court found that Parliament's decision not to change the law did indeed strike a fair balance between the interests of the wider community and the interests of people who are in that tragic position. That was upheld by the Court of Appeal. It is